Hi, this video is designed to help you work through problem set 1, question 3. And so this presents a very similar kind of problem and shows you how I work through that. Hopefully if you review this, then it will make question 3 on problem set 1 a lot easier. So let's just start with the very beginning of this question. It presents us with the information about an individual firm in the handmade cigar industry. So an individual firm in this industry has a total cost function of CQ equals 100 plus 1.25Q plus 0.0625Q squared. All right, so the key with this, as you look at the first question, which is what is each firm's supply curve and what is the market supply curve, the key is to remember that each firm will supply as long as the price being provided by buyers in the market is greater than or equal to the firm's marginal cost. So if I have a price of $6, I will supply as long as the marginal cost of each unit is less than $6, because if the price is greater than the marginal cost, I'm going to make money on that unit. As soon as the price drops below marginal cost, I won't provide that because I would lose money on that unit. And so we can find the supply curve by remembering that price is equal to marginal cost will give us that individual firm supply curve. So I've got a total cost curve here, and what I need to do as a first step to get the firm's individual supply curve is to take the derivative of that total cost curve and find my marginal cost. Okay, so the total cost curve is 100 plus 1.25Q plus 0.0625Q squared. Okay, so we take the derivative of this with respect to Q to get the marginal cost. So marginal cost equals, remember with this first term, this constant term, the derivative is 0. With this linear term, the derivative is just whatever that constant is in front of the Q term. And then when we have a squared term, we bring the power down, so that's 2. We multiply it times the constant in front of the Q term, and then we decrease the power of the Q term by 1. And so we get 2 times 0.0625Q, and if we multiply this out, that gives us 0.125Q. And so our total marginal cost curve is 1.25 plus 0.125Q. And then that marginal cost, remember, we set price equal to marginal cost, and that's going to give us our individual supply curve. Really what's going to give us is our inverse supply curve for an individual firm. Right? So to put this in a framework that looks more like a typical supply curve, what we want to do is we want to get the Q term here by itself. Right? And so the first thing that we can do is move this constant term over to the left side with the price. So we get price minus 1.25 is equal to 0.125Q. And then if we divide through by 0.125 on both sides, what we're going to get is Q by itself. Right? So this thing, we'll get Q by itself on the right-hand side, and on the left-hand side, we get price divided by 0.125 minus 1.25 over 0.125, which is going to be 10, right? Okay, so then we've got our individual supply curve for each of the firms. And then we want to go from here, and we want to get us a market supply curve. So I'm going to go ahead and apologize in advance. My cat Leo, as you can see here, is very excited about this problem set and wants to help us out. And so you may see his paws from time to time. Okay, so this is for an individual firm, and this is how much the individual firm is going to supply. If you want to, you can go ahead and change this fraction, which is 1 over 0.125. You can change it into another number. It would be, if we multiply that out, or sorry, divide that out, you'll get 8. So this would just be 8P minus 10 equals Q. And that's what an individual firm is going to supply for any given price. So if we want to then think about what the industry is going to supply, well, the industry contains 10 firms, right? So we're going to do 10 times what an individual firm would do. And an individual firm is going to do 8p minus 10. So if we multiply that all the way through to get industry supply, what we're going to get is that industry supply is equal to 80p minus 100. Okay, so this is the industry supply curve. We have the individual supply curve, and we have the inverse supply curve for the individual firm. Okay, so that's the answer for part A. Okay, part B says, let me bring this back. Suppose market demand is QD equals 2300 minus 40p. What is the equilibrium price and quantity? All right, so we've got a market demand, we've got a market supply. To figure out equilibrium price and quantity, we want to set the two things equal to each other. All right, so we've got demand on this side, 2300 minus 40p. That's our demand. Here comes Leo again to help us. And then on the right-hand side, we've got our supply, 80p minus 100. Okay, and so what we want to do now is solve for the price that makes demand and supply equal, right? And that will give us our equilibrium price, and then from there we can calculate equilibrium quantity. And so what we'll do is we'll bring all of our p terms over to the same side. So let's bring all of the p terms over to the right-hand side. So 80p, and then we're going to, of course, have to add this 40p to both sides to make it disappear. So plus 40p plus 40p. All right, that's going to give us 120p. And then we'll take all of the constant terms over to the left-hand side. So we've got 2300 here, and then we're going to add 100 to both sides. And we're going to get 2400 equals 120p, or dividing through, we're going to get that price is equal to 20. Okay, so if we know price is equal to 20, then we can just set that, we can just put that into either our supply or our demand curve, and we can get our quantity. So let's put it into the demand side. So we get 2300 minus 40 times 20. 40 times 20 is going to be 800. So we get 2300 minus 800, which is equal to 1500. All right, so that's our quantity. So quantity equals 1500. That's right. So here's our equilibrium quantity, and here's our equilibrium price. Okay, so far so good. Then part C of this question asks us to calculate total surplus in this market. Okay, so the easiest way to calculate total surplus is to do it by thinking of this as an easy diagram. So let me just show you what I mean. Right. So we know if we've got, bring that down, if we've got a demand curve that's linear, and of course we do, right? Our demand is 2300 minus 40p, right? That's a linear demand. And if we have a linear supply, right? If we have a linear supply curve, then we're going to have total surplus, which is going to be equal to the difference between the willingness to pay for all those units that actually get traded and the marginal cost, right? So that will be our total surplus, and we can divide it into two pieces. The top half is going to be consumer surplus, right? That's the amount that consumers are willing to pay, and it's the difference between their willingness to pay and the price that they actually pay. That's the surplus that they get. And then the producer surplus is the difference between the price that they receive for the goods that they sell and the cost of making those goods. So that's the producer surplus, and consumer surplus plus producer surplus equals total surplus. Right, so that's what we're trying to find. And so the easiest way to do this, because we have linear demand curves, is to essentially recognize the fact that we've got some really easy triangles here to calculate. And if we can figure for consumer surplus, if we can get this intercept, right? If we know what that intercept is, and we know what the price is, that gives us this distance here, the height of this triangle. And then obviously the quantity is going to give us the length of the triangle, and then we can use the fact that the area of the triangle is equal to 1/2 times the height versus the width. All right. So we already know what price is. We already know what quantity is. Price is equal to 20. Quantity is equal to 1,500. And so the one thing we need here is the intercept. All right, once we have the intercept, it'll be really easy to calculate consumer surplus. So recall that the demand curve, right, quantity demanded is equal to 2,300 minus 40p. All right. Now, this is the demand curve, but what we have drawn here on our graph is actually the inverse demand curve, right? Because this axis, the y-axis is dollars, and the x-axis is quantity, right? And so to graph that, we have to have the term that's on the y-axis, which is our price, that has to be by itself, right? Because we're thinking back to our old friend, you know, y equals mx plus b. That's the line where we can say this is the intercept and this is the slope. And so we need the y term, which is the dollar sign, by itself. So we have to take our demand curve and get an inverse demand curve. How do we get an inverse demand curve? We just want price to be by itself. All right, so what we can do, right now we've got a negative term on the right-hand side. We can move it over to the left-hand side to make it positive. So add 40p to both sides. Right? Then we're going to get 40p. And then subtract quantity demanded from both sides. So we get 40p equals 2,300 minus QD. All right? And then we just divide by 40 on both sides. So and that's going to give us our inverse demand curve. Price equals 2,300 divided by 40 minus 1 over 40 QD. All right, so this is our slope term and this is our intercept term, right? So the intercept here is 2,300 divided by 40. Bring that down so you can see it. Let's see. There we go. All right, so now we can calculate consumer surplus, right? So let's do it right here. Consumer surplus is equal to 1/2 outside of the height. So we want the distance between 2,300 over 40 and 20. So it might be easiest for us first to simplify this. So 2,300 over 40 is the same as 57.5. That's what you get if you get your handy dandy calculator out. So 57.5 minus 20, that's our height, and our width is 1,500. So our consumer surplus is going to be 1/2 times 37.5, right, times 1,500, and that's going to be 28,125, right? So that's our consumer surplus. Now we got to figure out producer surplus, right? And producer surplus is we're going to use the same formula, right? So it's going to be 1/2 times the base or the width, which is 1,500, times this height. And once again, we know what this point is. We know the 20, and so we've got to figure out what this number is, right? And we're going to get that from our supply curve. But just like we had to rearrange our demand curve here to figure out the intercept of the inverse demand curve, we're going to have to take our supply curve and rearrange it, all right? So the supply curve is 80p minus 100. We want the p to be by itself, right? So that's the quantity supplied. So we get 80p, add 100 to both sides. 80p equals the quantity supplied plus 100, divide by 80 on both sides, and we get price is equal to quantity supplied over 80 plus 100 over 80, right? And so this is our intercept term, 100 over 80. And 100 over 80, well, we can simplify that. So that's 10 over 8, right? Or 5 over 4, or 1.25. All right, sorry, my computer went to sleep. So 1.25 is our intercept here, okay? And so we can go back up to our graph, and we get that producer surplus is equal to 1/2 times 20 minus 1.25 times 1,500, which is equal to, all right, well, so this is 18.75, right? 18.75 times 1,500 divided by 2 is equal to 14,062.5. All right, so we've got our consumer surplus and our producer surplus. Total surplus is just the two together. So 28,125 plus 14,062.5, or 42,187.5. Okay, so that's our total surplus in this perfectly competitive market with no government intervention. Okay, all right, so a lot of work so far. If you have any questions about this, hit pause, walk through it, see if you understand where I'm getting everything from, where my different equations and things came from, and hopefully it will make sense to you. Okay. So then the next thing to do is to move on to the next question, which is about changing this nice, perfectly competitive market by letting the government interfere. All right, so the question says, suppose the government imposed a $6 tax on cigars. How would this change the market equilibrium? All right, so let's first just approach this graphically, okay? So let's think about what happens on a graph. All right, so we know what the market demand looks like and the market supply looks like without any interruptions, right? So we've already done this. We've got a price of 20 and a quantity of 1,500. This is 1.25, and this up here is 57.5. So those are just the numbers that we used in the last graph, right? So that's our market before the government interferes. And then what we're going to do is we're going to add a tax, so a tax of $6, right? So remember what a tax really does. What a tax does is it says that the price that the buyer pays is going to differ from the price that the seller receives, right? So whatever the buyer pays, the price to the buyer, it is equal to the price the seller gets plus the $6. And this is the same regardless of how the tax is collected, right? So if the cigar store has to collect the tax, then the buyer pays a certain amount, say they pay $30, then $6 of that would go to the government and 24 would go to the seller, right? So it doesn't matter what the price is, the two prices are separated by $6, right? And so what we want to do is to put the price that the buyer and the price that the seller pays, we want to kind of put them in relationship to each other. So we're looking for an equilibrium in this market where, given the price that the buyer pays and the price that the seller receives and the fact that they're separated by $6, that we'll still have the same quantity demanded and supplied, all right? So what we're going to do is we're going to think about how that wedge, that tax wedge, is going to change things. And so what I want to do is think about this supply curve, but I want to translate it, because right now the supply curve is based on the price to the seller, right? So remember that the supply curve, because we've already looked at this, the supply curve, quantity supplied, is equal to 80 times the price the seller gets minus 100, right? So that's what this supply curve is. The other thing we can think about, though, is what does the supply look like based on the price that the buyer pays, right? And so if the seller's price is equal to, right, we can rearrange this, the seller's price is equal to the price the buyer pays minus $6. So I can rewrite this supply curve and make it in terms of the price that the buyer pays, right? So what would that look like? So we'd have the quantity supplied is equal to 80 times the price the buyer pays minus $6 minus 100, right? So that's one way to translate that. I can also translate it graphically. Of course, remember this is the supply curve, and what I have graphed here is the inverse supply curve. I've got price by itself, right? And so if I invert this, what am I going to get? I'm going to get 80 PB, right, minus 80 times 6 is, let's see, that's 480 minus 100. Okay, make that, it's our supply curve, our newly transformed supply curve. Now let's put this all in terms of the inverse supply so we can graph it. So E minus 480, 80 PB minus 480 minus 100. All right, so we want to get PB all by itself. So let's take the 480 and the 100 over to the left-hand side. So we get quantity supplied plus 580 equals 80 PB. And then we can just divide through, and we get equals QS over 80 plus 580 divided by 80, or 58 divided by 8, right? And then if we want to simplify that even further, we can get that this is equal to, let's see, 8 goes into 58. Well, 8 times 7 is 56, so that's 7 and 2 eighths, 7.1.25. All right, so this is our new quantity supplied over 80. Sorry, quantity supplied over 80 plus 7.25 equals price to the buyer. So this is the supply curve translated into the buyer's price. And note that it has the same slope as our initial inverse supply curve, but its intercept is increased from 125 to 725. Right? So really what we have is just a supply curve that's shifted up by the amount of the tax, right? The distance here between these two curves is $6, right? And so what we've done is we have just created this shadow supply curve. And what we're looking for is this point here, where the demand curve, which is clearly based on the price to the buyer, and the supply curve translated based on price to the buyer is the same, right? That's what we're looking for. We want to find that intersection, and that's going to give us then the price to the buyer and the total quantity traded, and then we can figure out the price to the seller by just subtracting 6. Right, so that's where we're going with here. Okay, so a little bit of a long-winded explanation, but I just wanted to make sure you understand why when we are doing tax problems, we shift the supply curve up by the amount of the tax, right? So we've just worked through it here. If we had a subsidy instead of a tax, we would just shift it in the opposite direction, right? So instead of subtracting $6 from the price to the buyer, we would add to the price to the buyer. But we're not going to do a subsidy today. All right, so what we have now is sort of a plan of attack for figuring out what the equilibrium quantity is with the tax. Okay, so we've got the same demand curve we had before. Our demand curve is going to be, let's see, let me get back to the very beginning. Our demand curve is 2,300 minus 40 times the price to the buyer. That's our demand curve. And our supply curve, once again, just for ease, we want to go up here to our supply curve rather than using the inverse supply curve. We're just going to go up here to it, right? So that's going to be 80 times the price to the buyer minus 580. Okay, so that's what we're setting equal to each other. This is the quantity demanded, and this is the quantity supplied relative to the buyer's price. So we gather all the PB terms on one side. We get 120 PB, right, because I'm going to add 40 to both sides. And then we gather all of the constant terms to the left side, right, so I'm going to add 580 to both sides, and I'll get 2880. So 2880 equals 120 times the price to the buyer. So the price to the buyer is equal to 2880 divided by 120, right? So that's our new equilibrium price under this tax of $6, and just figuring out what that is, right? So we will just then divide through, and from that we can get that the price to the buyer, so let's get rid of the zeros, so 12 into 288. I realize that you guys couldn't see all of that. So 12 into 288, well, 12 times 2 is 24, and 12 times 4 is 48. So the price to the buyer is equal to $24. That means the price to the seller is equal to $18, right? 24 minus 6 gives us 18. And then the quantity, we can stick either one of these back in. Let's just go ahead and stick 24 back in here. So the quantity is 2,300 minus 40 times 24. And if you multiply that out and divide, that's going to give you a quantity of 1,340. Okay, so now we have under our tax our new prices. There's two prices and our new quantity. All right, that was a lot of work. Okay, we're almost at the end. We're not quite there. All right, so we got a couple more questions that we need to answer. All right, so we know how the market changes. We know that the price increases for the buyers from $20 to $24, and it drops for the sellers from $20 to $18. And overall, the quantity drops from 1,500 to 1,340. Okay, so we know that. How much revenue does the tax collect, and how is the burden of this tax shared between the buyers and sellers? All right, so how much revenue does the tax collect? Well, we've got 1,340 units that are going to be sold, and we've got a $6 tax on each one of them. And so the total tax is going to be $8,040, right? That's the total amount of the tax. How is it split between consumers and sellers? Well, the price to consumers goes up by 4. And the price to the sellers goes down by 2. So for each unit, there's a $6 tax, and consumers are paying 4 of it, and sellers are paying 2 of it. So consumers are basically paying 2/3, and sellers are paying 1/3. So that's how it's split, 2/3, 1/3. Okay, we are in the home stretch. One last question. All right. Calculate the marginal excess tax burden of the tax policy. Okay, so do you remember what the marginal excess tax burden is? The marginal excess tax burden is defined as the deadweight loss divided by the amount of taxes raised. All right, that's the marginal excess tax burden. Because remember, you're going to raise that money, but when you raise that money, you're going to create some deadweight loss in society. And so we want to know for every dollar raised, how much deadweight loss is created. That's the marginal excess tax burden. Okay, so we're going to need one new piece of information. We've got to calculate deadweight loss. We know taxes raised, right? We've already figured that out. That's $8,040. Okay, so how do we figure out deadweight loss? All right, let's go back to this picture here. All right, so remember, deadweight loss is going to be that amount of surplus that we're no longer gaining because of the tax. So in the first part, remember we said we had consumer surplus equal to the distance between willingness to pay and price paid for those units that were bought. And that we had producer surplus equal to the price paid and the marginal cost of production for those units that were sold, right? So it was this whole triangle. Now what's happened with the tax? Well, really what the tax has done is it's decreased the amount that we are going to consume, right? And so we're going to look at what's that lost surplus. That lost surplus is this amount here, right? It's the area of this triangle where the base is the difference between how much was purchased and how much is purchased under the tax. So under the tax, we are going to sell 1,340 units. All right, so that's going to be the base of this triangle. And then the height, well, look what that height is. It's just the difference between the price to the buyer and the price to the seller, or it's the amount of the tax. And so we can figure out deadweight loss pretty quickly. Deadweight loss is equal to the area of this triangle, so 1/2 times the base. The base is 1,500 minus 1,340 times the height, right? And the height is just that $6 tax, all right? So 1/2 times 6, that's easy, that's 3. And then 1,500 minus 1,340, right? That's 160. And so the deadweight loss associated with this tax is going to be 480. That's our deadweight loss. And we can take, there we go. We can take that back to our definition of marginal excess tax burden. And the marginal excess tax burden is then the deadweight loss, or 480, divided by the total tax, which was $8,040. And so it's going to give us a marginal excess tax burden. If you divide these out, which I can do on my calculator, I get 0.597. Okay, so that's the marginal excess tax burden. Thanks for sticking with me through this. Hopefully every bit of this made sense, but if it doesn't, come see me or go see Doris and we'll walk you through it and make sure that you understand it. If you can do this, you should be able to do problem number 3 on problem set 1 without any trouble. It's basically the same thing with different curves, so that you just have to use different numbers, but you walk through it with the same process. So take a look at that, see how it works, and come ask me if you have any questions. Thanks.